So anyway, hello, I'm Claire. I'm a user experience researcher and designer. I'm originally from a psychology background. So I don't generally really claim to be a designer, so kind of, if you think my slides are not nice enough for a designer, that's why. Psychologists can't make things look nice to save their lives. I'm currently the service design manager for a company called AlertMe, some of you may know about. We essentially make connected home technology. So I work on things like heating systems, energy monitoring, security systems, safety, home safety, general kind of home automation type stuff. I'm here in my own capacity, because I should probably point that out, because I may get a bit ranty from time to time. My opinions are my own. But I will be talking about some of the stuff that I work on. So essentially, my interest in this really is in products and services that sort of do mundane, everyday things and are useful, usable, and pleasurable or fun in some way to use for kind of mass market consumers. I didn't even know that there was a word for CIOT was a phrase, but I do now thanks to Patrick's talk. Sorry? Oh, okay. Well, there you go. It's a meme now. That's two of us, so we can turn it into a meme. And I kind of think of it really as how do you get this stuff sort of to be things that people buy in Argos and Boots and IKEA, and not spend £180 in the Apple Store on 3 light bulbs. Not that there's anything wrong with you. And I think the reason I'm interested in the sort of mundane everyday things is I think in the sort of things that we like to kind of ignore in everyday life because we don't give them a lot of conscious attention. They don't superficially seem that exciting. There's actually a lot of very interesting human problems. Now, I know that there are many things that will be talked about today which are not necessarily consumer systems, but are very interesting and very worthwhile of their own accord. This is not intended in any way to be a criticism of that, and it's perfectly valuable to make things that target innovators or early adopters. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this Diffusion of Innovations diagram and later variants of it. I think that if we want IoT to reach its full potential, then at some point we need to find ways of making things that work for these kind of late majority people, the kind of the 50%, the people who kind of like think of the web and they instantly kind of think of Facebook. And for doing that kind of stuff, really good user experience is one of the very important things we need to get us there. So I'd like to talk about 3 things that we have to kind of figure out how to crack for the consumer market. Now these are not necessarily entirely unique to IoT, but they are sort of, given where we are now, really quite relevant. And that's a clear proposition, clear conceptual models, and good interusability, which is a phrase I'll come back to. Now, some people don't think of propositions and sort of productization and that kind of thing as necessarily being the same thing as being UX. I think it's where the UX starts. This is really kind of, if people don't understand what your thing does and sort of why they might want it, it doesn't really matter how clever the rest of the design is. It's just not going to make sense to them. And I think what the mass market sort of tends to want and need is products that do something of value for an amount of money and effort that seems kind of in proportion to that value. Now, as I said, I work in home automation, and there's a 40-year history in that world of things that sort of haven't quite made it with the mass market because they either weren't aware of them or they were too complicated or expensive for the things that they were seen to do. This is X10 Powerhouse for the Commodore 64 from 1986. I don't know whether anyone has used this. I'd like to talk to you if you have. And this does things like control appliances and lights and heating. And you can even use it from a phone. And this sounds like an awful lot like the kind of stuff I work on and like some of the things that people get excited about on Kickstarter now. But it's kind of pretty much 30 years old, so there are many good reasons why, clever as this may have been, there are many good reasons why this isn't, your granny's not using this right now. And I think that although we are now making things that are cheaper and better designed and we can buy in the Apple Store and are often much easier to use, I think there's still a bit of a challenge here in terms of getting to that sort of real mass market, which is that we're sort of often, I would think of it as a dichotomy between products and tools. Now, a product in the eyes of a consumer who sort of is buying something to do something which is not, perhaps something that runs in the background they just want to work, is looking for something that makes a promise to solve a specific problem and then comes sort of reasonably well configured to kind of do that. And something like Nest Protect that was mentioned earlier I think is quite an interesting example of this. Nest do this very well. If you look at the advertising for the Nest Protect, it doesn't talk about connectivity in it anywhere. It talks about how it is a less annoying smoke alarm and works better as a smoke alarm and doesn't wake you up by beeping in the middle of the night. Right down the bottom it says, when the battery runs low, we will send an alert to your phone. And that's the only mention of connectivity in this anywhere. So do the people who are buying this at the moment know that they're buying the Internet of Things? Yes, they probably do. But as the people who are buying this type of stuff, when it isn't quite as expensive as that, arguably might never need to know that. Now, I got in trouble last time I showed this because someone at Belkin got upset because they thought I was dissing their UX, which I'm not at all. But I think the Belkin Wemo is an example of a class of things where there's a lot of the kind of consumer-ish IoT products that are coming out at the moment sort of still fall into this category. I think this is a tool. It's something that where you have to get value from it, you essentially have to sort of define your own problem, figure out that this is the tool for you, and then configure it to deliver that value. That is not a bad thing to do at all, but it's not something that I think the majority of people would find that kind of a little bit of there's a bit of a hill to sort of get over to be able to do that, and it's certainly not something people are going to have the time or energy to do in every single area of their lives. So the second thing is to do with a conceptual model. And this is something designers like to talk about, which basically means, what are the concepts that people have to understand about the system and how do those things relate to each other? So it's it's sort of meta UX, if you like. Now, I work a lot on heating systems, so I'm going to talk a bit about those in the next few slides. Now, for a conventional heating system that we might typically have in the UK, which isn't connected to anything apart from itself, the conceptual model might go a little bit like there's a sort of ugly box on the wall that's a bit confusing and I don't really understand it particularly, but that's the thing that sort of turns the heating on and off, and I can use to turn it up and down. And then there's a giant box that sits hopefully in a cupboard that's full of hot water, and that makes the water hot and that gets passed around to the radiators. Now, if I'm lucky, it doesn't go wrong very often, although when it does go wrong, it tends to be at the worst possible time of year. And when it goes wrong, I need to get someone round who does some voodoo, and then hopefully it works again. So it's not necessarily a very well understood system, but we kind of have an idea of what the parts are and what they do. Now, this is an example of the Alert Me remote heating controller, which is something I work on. You can get a version of this from British Gas. And this is essentially very similar to a conventional heating system. The thermostat, it's not a high-end piece of design like a Nest necessarily, but it has the thermostat then connects via a hub over Zigbee via a hub out to an internet service, and then you can control that from a smartphone app, which we've done a lot of user testing on, and we think we've certainly made it kind of much easier to use than the thermostat. But for consumer, there's some new concepts in this. There are more things. So there's a hub, which for a lot of people who've never encountered something like a hub before is a kind of voodoo box, and it's like, well, I don't really know what this thing does, and why does that need to be on, and it's got a light on it, and that kind of stuff. And then there are some other things you need to understand, such as, because there are more things, those things can lose power or they can lose connectivity. So there's some different classes of things that can go wrong. So when this is working well enough, it's just you press the buttons on the phone app and stuff happens, and that's okay. But because there are more things that can go wrong, then there are you need to have a little bit more of a model of the system to understand what things might happen. Now, when I've been talking to people who use this kind of systems, and they say things like, well, why do I get an email from the heating system when the internet's gone down at home? And what their sort of idea is that this is a heating system is something that just kind of runs in the house and sort of doesn't bug me. But now it's sent me an email to tell me that the internet is down. Does that mean that the heating's not working? And so that, there's a sort of confusion here. Now, the reason that it sends you an email is actually because it's running on a platform that also runs security systems. And some people have both heating and security. And so if you have that stuff as a package, you do actually need to know that the internet's gone down, because your burglar alarm won't be able to tell you if it goes off. But in the context of heating, if that's all you have, that's quite a confusing thing. One of the other things I've heard is people saying, well, if I'm using my smartphone app and I'm abroad and I'm trying to reset the heating so that it comes on at a certain time, is it working off the time zone that I'm in now that it's using on my phone, or is it working off the time zone in the house? And I think these are all kind of interesting examples of sort of where we're starting to ask people to understand a little bit more about the system model in order to be able to get value from it. So although there's more benefit in this from having remote control of the heating system, there are some other things we're asking people to think about. And something like lighting is an example, a good example as well. If you have lighting rules that are running sort of somewhere in that are turning lights on and off at various times of day, what happens, again, if the internet goes down? What happens to your home? What happens if something loses power? Are those things still running? So you need to have some idea of whether that stuff is running on the hub, on something that's within the home, or whether it's running in a cloud service, in which case if the internet goes down, your lights don't work. It's an additional layer of complexity. I was talking to a guy called Alan Blackwell, who's a professor of human-computer interaction at Cambridge, and he said what's really interesting about this is that we've actually broken the principle of direct manipulation with some of this. So there's a sort of 30-year-old sort of idea in user interface design that sort of that making things more usable means giving people the ability to act directly on objects and to see a response from those objects, whether that's a physical thing or whether that's a digital object on screen. And what we're doing here is moving to a model that's more like programming, in the very loose sense of making things run in different places or at different times. And that's an extra level of abstraction that a lot of people are perhaps not used to. I'm not suggesting that it's bad to help make this easier for them to understand, but I think we just need to be aware that the idea that I do something on this device at 4 o'clock and on the other side of the world something else happens somewhere else is quite and that may subsequently repeat in future, and you need to be aware of why these things are happening is actually quite challenging. And I think that if we're not careful with the design of some of these things, we'll run into what a guy called Scott Jensen, who's currently at Google, calls the surprise package, which is taking a mass market product that's quite successful and turning it back into an early adopter product again by adding in more complexity. Now, the thing about conceptual models is that what I've slightly been conflating this with the system model. It's not actually the same thing as building a system and then training people to try to understand that. It's really about learning what they need and trying to design something that fits with the way that people think and their existing knowledge and behaviours. Now, there's quite a lot of this in home automation systems. One of those that I've bumped into is a sort of mismatch between the way that home automation systems kind of typically track who's in and who's out. So there's this idea that there's a set of users of the system, and they're either at home or they're not at home, and they may have permissions for certain things that they're allowed to do. And sort of superficially, that kind of makes logical sense. What I found when you put this stuff in front of people who are not really kind of experts and start testing it is they go, well, yeah, that's all right, but that sort of doesn't really work for me because, for example, I've got teenagers and sometimes they're in for the purpose of the heating system, but and the burglar alarm, but they're not in for the purpose of answering the door. So that kind of there's a sort of quantum state of like and actually I really don't want to spend half my life trying to be a sysadmin and allocating permissions to people. So the final thing is about interusability. Now, this is obviously aware of interoperability, about making things work with other things. There's a parallel in UX design, which is interusability, which is what happens to UX design when it's distributed across different devices with different capabilities. Now, in my previous job at Fjord, we worked on an EU consortium looking into this stuff. There isn't a huge amount out there in the literature, but there is a paper. I can tweet this if anyone's interested at the end, which gives comes up with proposes quite a good model for it. And there are three constructs in this. Now, the first one is composition, which is quite related to the conceptual model. This is about which devices you choose to have and how functionality is distributed between them. And now the example, again, heating examples here. You may be familiar with the Tado system. This is a German heating system that uses smartphone location as a proxy for presence in the house. So if everybody has a smartphone, you can figure out who's at home and set the heating schedule, adjust the heating schedule accordingly. Now, the thermostat controller here is a plain white box. It doesn't have any buttons or screen on it, which presumably keeps the manufacturing cost down, which is great. Of course, the limitation of that is that if anybody who doesn't have that smartphone app or temporarily doesn't have access to that smartphone is trying to use it, then they haven't got access to the heating. So this is something that will probably work well for some people and not for others. The Alert Me system, again, it's the slightly ugly basic box. Has all the sort of functionality of the normal heating controller with the smartphone app. So although you run into issues of things trying to be consistent with trying to maintain a degree of consistency between the two interfaces, at least you haven't taken anything away from the original system. The second one is consistency. Now, this is obviously something that gets talked about in design quite a bit. In the context of different devices with quite different sort of capabilities, this is about trying to create interfaces that feel appropriate to those devices, but also feel like a family. Now, to use Nest again as an example of this, the Nest wall stat has a twiddly knob which makes a clicky noise, which you use for adjusting the temperature, amongst other things. Twiddly knobs replicated on touch screens don't really work very well at all for the kind of small adjustments you need to make for heating. So there's an up and down arrow, but when you tap on the up and down arrows, it makes the same clicking noise that you hear from the wall stat, which ties it together quite nicely. And the final one is to do with continuity. Now, this is this kind of continuity, as in sort of flower pots not appearing and disappearing on Coronation Street. This is to do with what happens when you start an interaction on one device and see that replicated around the system. So something like the fuel band. You set your goal and then you see that on the device itself. Now, a lot of the knottiest design problems I've run into working on IoT systems are actually continuity challenges. And it sounds quite obvious that if you interact with the service on one device, then you would expect all the other devices to reflect that change in state. You know, this is a basic principle of feedback of system status in usability. So, to use a heating example again, if you turn the target temperature up on the wall stat, you would expect to see that reflected on the phone app straight away and vice versa. But sometimes this isn't technically possible, and then you start running into some interesting problems. So in the case of the Alert Me system, there can be a delay of up to 2 minutes before the two are in sync. And that's because the wall thermostat runs off a battery, because the heating market in the UK, engineers prefer installing battery-operated controllers. So sending data to the network uses a lot of power. So you can't run Wi-Fi, you can't maintain a constant network connection. So it runs over Zigbee and pings the network every couple of minutes. And if it sent it more frequently than that, it would run the battery down very fast. Now that works well enough for heating, but obviously in something like for an elderly care alarm or an alarm system, potentially you've got to find ways to work around that, and you also have to find ways to sort of mitigate this in the UI on the phone. So how do you do you show the command as being in progress of being sent, or do you just kind of assume that something has been sent and then tell people if it's not actually been acted on? And the right solution obviously depends on the exact context. So what I hope you may take away from this is that actually UX for the Internet of Things runs quite deep. It isn't just about the sort of UI and the kind of interaction design layers. It's also about how those UIs across different devices work together. It's obviously about industrial design because there are physical things involved. It's about the service design and sort of end-to-end customer experience and perhaps not just digital touch points. How do you make sure that this stuff keeps running? How do you help provide people with support? It's about the conceptual model, so how you want people to think about the system that helps them figure it out better. It's about how it's productized and sort of figuring out what people want from stuff and how to make the products make sense to them. And something I'd love to talk about afterwards, if anyone's interested, is about what I would call platform design. which is about the sort of conceptual architecture of how you get multiple products and things working together. So I think that Rick used the word meta model earlier on, and I think there's a UX parallel for this of allowing people to figure out how different things can work together and suggest sensible functionality for them without spending their lives being sysadmins. I won't summarise. Thank you very much.
Awesome.